Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Monday, happy Labor Day to all those who celebrate. We are still going to be doing a fantasy show for you guys today, and I thought it would be interesting, since we are less than 1 week away from the start of the NFL season, to do a deep dive into certain skill position groups around the league to see which of them gives you the most value. So today we start off in the world of the AFC with teams such as the Bengals and their running back situation, the Broncos as well. Very strong group, a strong trio, in fact, of running backs you could be selecting in fantasy football drafts if you haven't done yours already. Also looking at the LA Chargers becoming the Ravens of the West with their two running backs. And we also will conclude all of our sleepers and busts for this year as well as we round out with the tight ends. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to, now that we are a live show, avail yourselves to all the features that YouTube has to offer, including the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features as well. Anything you leave for the show, as well as tips and donations, are greatly appreciated, especially with both me, my fellow podcasters. Go check them out as well on both networks, Sports and Podcast Network for GSMC. So yes, anything you do leave is greatly appreciated. You all have been excellent in terms of leaving comments, highly interactive. I want to keep that interaction going before we get into and once we get into the NFL season. But without further ado, let's start off today's show and our week show. Starting off, like I said, in the AFC, doing a deep dive into certain team situations in terms of their skill position groups. We're starting off with the team kind of transitioning to a more committee approach. Perhaps it's the nature of this division in that you see a lot of committee approaches with the Ravens over the years, the Steelers, and maybe now the Browns, since Nick Chubb, we don't know what his situation is. But this team has always seemed to have a solid running back, but now it is different. It is going to be two guys in that backfield getting the bulk of the carries, and it could affect how you value them both in fantasy. They're not necessarily top-end guys. They're not, in fact, even in any of the tiers I mentioned for the running back position, but they are guys who are interesting, say if you are in a super flex league or a high upside PPR league. And when I think about the Bengals offense, I think that there are many opportunities for these two guys to break out. And so we start off with the Cincinnati Bengals. Like I said, they always had Joe Mixon there along with Joe Burrow. Very nice backfield, but now Joe Mixon has gone to the Houston Texans. So they bring in Zach Moss, recently of the Buffalo Bills and Indianapolis Colts, and then rookie Chase Brown coming into his second year. So that's going to be a very interesting backfield. Like I said, two guys not necessarily highly coveted at the running back position, but still add a lot of value. That being said, rumors from camp are that Zach Moss will get the bulk of the carries and Chase Young will be used in situations where, they can set up the screen game, because I think he is potent in that area. Like I said, in both the run and pass game, both of these guys will look to get a lot of targets, but I think Chase Brown, to that effect, will be more centralized in the pass game. Let's talk about how to compare these two guys stat-wise in terms of their fantasy value as well. So let's start off with Zach Moss. Last year, played with the Indianapolis Colts. Kind of was their backup to Jonathan Taylor, but still got a lot of good minutes, especially after Anthony Richardson went down. 183 carries last year, 794 yards, was 27th in the league, so in the top 30, 986 yards, in fact, from scrimmage. He had 5 touchdowns and a solid, but not necessarily superstar solid, 4.3 yards per carry. So he had 8 starts with the Colts. He actually did have 3 games of 20-plus fantasy points, and he carried the football more than 18 times in 6 of those games that he played. So, as you can see, very well-rounded player. I think that in this Bengals system, he's going to be looking for a lot of red zone touches, perhaps. Maybe more of a power workhorse back. I don't necessarily see him as someone who projects to be quote-unquote elusive. That's kind of where Chase Brown comes in. But at the end of the day, I think that if you are in a fantasy league that's more of a super flex situation, you can definitely implement him because he will have a lot of carries, a lot of production, especially if they view him as someone who can get going on early downs. Then we transition to the Chase Brown situation. Last year kind of was a revelation, did not get as many carries in the system because obviously he was sitting behind Joe Mixon. But this year could be his year, especially in the receiving game, because last year he averaged a solid 14.4 yards per reception on screens, 7 touchdowns in fact off of screens for Chase Brown. So if you're looking for someone who's going to get a lot of volume in terms of, say, whether or not you're in a PPR league, then Chase Brown might be the guy for you. But when I look at the Bengals running back room and the running back rooms they've had in the recent past, this is profiling as one that really gets to vary this offense. And if you like teams that spread the ball around in so many different ways, look to the Bengals. Because while these guys, like I said, aren't starting running backs, they are guys who can add value either off your bench as a super flex option, a flex option in regular leagues. But at the end of the day, do be wary that this is the first time where the Bengals are in a new horizon in terms of breaking in running backs. They don't have Joe Mixon as a fallback plan, a guy who combines speed, power, and strength. They have 2 guys now who you're really going to have to look at through the lens of how this offense is going to operate. That being said, if I were to pick one of these guys as someone who could project to move into higher tiers of this offense, and in terms of the running back market, I would say Zach Moss at this current moment in time, because I think that he's more of a traditional style of running back, kind of a physical breed, but he also is able to get into the receiving game a little bit. Whereas Chase Brown is still young. This is only his second year in the league that it's going to be, and he still has the opportunity to work his way into this offense. So he's not there yet. He definitely has perhaps more potential in the long-term future than Zach Moss, but in the short term, look for Zach Moss to be the guy in the Bengals offense and in terms of someone who could rise quickly through the ranks. But now let's talk about the Bengals as a whole and how this could affect them as a team going forward. Because I really think it's going to come down to these 2 guys in terms of the Bengals offense. Because there are going to be moments where, Joe Burrow maybe is going to need to rely on the shorter passing game. Or maybe going to need to rely on the running backs more than usual. Like I said recently in previous episodes, he is working his way back into this offense after the wrist injury. Did not necessarily play all of training camp this past couple of training camp sessions. So he's working his way back into this offense. And as a result, he may be more comfortable just distributing the football to these versatile running backs, especially a guy like Zach Moss who just brings that level of experience. Maybe not the explosiveness of a Joe Mixon, but someone who can solidify the running back position with this poise and composure in terms of how he plays. And Chase Brown as well, especially in later downs in certain situations where it's maybe a 3rd and short, maybe he can get into the screen game as well. But it's all about the comfortability of Joe Burrow working his way back into this offense. And also paying attention to the contract situation. Obviously, like we said, T. Higgins franchise tagged already for at least this 1 year. Now it's all about Jamar Chase. He has sat out a couple of practices as this training camp has progressed. Still has 2 years left on his contract, but this is a situation that I think fantasy football managers, especially those who might be looking at the overall team rather than just one player from the Cincinnati Bengals, a lot of fantasy football managers should be looking at this situation as one to monitor, because if Jamar Chase say, misses a couple of games due to this holdout, then that could make things a little bit more interesting. Throw a wrench, perhaps, into the plans for the Cincinnati Bengals on the offensive side of the football. But back to the running back situation, I think that you can't go wrong if you choose to get these guys on your bench because they are two excellent backs in many different aspects. If you like PPR-like guys, then Chase Brown might be your guy. Maybe not right now immediately. He can still add value and depth right now, but in the long term, look for Chase Brown to grow into someone who you can rely upon in any fantasy league. But Zach Moss certainly is the more interesting of the two because right now he feels like a guy who is the perfect embodiment of a committee approach, but he also has the ability to not necessarily pad his stats, I would call it, but has the ability to have a breakout season and be kind of a security blanket for an offense much like the Bengals. But let me know what you think in the comments, whether or not you are liking the profile of this Bengals running back room, because it's a different approach for them. It's something that they haven't necessarily had, and it's a new experiment. I think that it could work for them in the long run because of the fact it alleviates some of the pressure and burden on Joe Burrow to get more vertical, and it kind of makes this offense a little bit more unpredictable in a good way. But that is, of course, whether or not this whole contract dispute with Jamar Chase can get solved. Because if it isn't, that's a little bit worrying if you are a Cincinnati Bengals fan or if you're a fantasy football manager who is looking at the Bengals as a team that you really like. But I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. But that should just about do it for this segment. Thank you guys all for tuning in. We'll be back after this short break to talk about another running back room, a trio this time in the AFC West. That could be very interesting. Like we said, we'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, continuing our deep dives around the NFL into certain skill position groups in fantasy terms, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider making yourselves available to the features that YouTube has to offer in terms of super chats, super thanks, and super stickers. We want this show to be as interactive as possible. You guys have been so great in terms of all the comments you are leaving. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns about the show throughout its entirety, please consider leaving them in the chat, and I will address them as well. It makes for a much better show. As much as I love to talk fantasy sports and ramble on, I do want your guys' opinions. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated, especially for the show and the network as a whole as well. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day, continuing our deep dive around the NFL, like I said, into exciting, intriguing skill position groups, especially in terms of fantasy. And let's start with a running back room that is a very nice trio, and it's going a little bit under the radar. The profile of this team really is becoming one of unpredictability, well, with head coach Sean Payton relying on a rookie quarterback to start off the year for him. And these three weapons that they have in their backfield each bring an attribute that I really like and you should like as well as fantasy football managers when you're trying to round out your football team. Like I said, this group, much like the Bengals, isn't necessarily a group where you have one superstar. It is a committee approach as well. In these next couple I'll be talking about all committee approaches. So these are guys who are not necessarily high-end players who you would draft early on. These are all guys who are fringe players who will be there and thereabouts in much later rounds. But, like I said, the reason why I'm so high on this particular running back room is because of all three guys and what they bring to the table. So let's talk about the Denver Broncos running back room. Now, the Denver Broncos, like I said, are perhaps going to be one of the more unpredictable teams in the NFL because I really don't know how much trust Sean Payton will put in Bo Nix. It seems like he's really excited about him. It seems like he is Sean Payton's guy, and he's glad that he drafted him, but there are still concerns that I have about this offense. Who will be the number one target? Will Courtland Sutton appreciate a guy other than Russell Wilson throwing him the ball? Will it still be a deep threat? Will Troy Franklin make a seamless transition because he has his quarterback who threw to him in college with him? There are so many questions about this team. But the place where they might have all the answers might be their running back room. It's one of the best in the league. And let's start off with the presumptive starter, at least the RB1 in camp, Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams has always seemed like a guy who should have already had his breakout season. This is his fourth season in the NFL to date. And he's always seemed like he's on the precipice of improving and really breaking out to be one of the better running backs in this league. But last year was kind of disappointing from him. So let's go over it. 217 carries, 774 yards, only 3 rushing touchdowns, 3.6 yards per carry, and only 12 of his 76 carries inside the red zone went for 10 plus yards. So that is kind of concerning for a player who we know has that explosiveness downfield, can really break out some nice runs, and ultimately adds so much variety and depth to this Broncos backfield. But he has 2 guys who I really like behind him who offer not necessarily similar traits, but traits that really supplement the entirety of this running back room. Let's start off with a guy who I really like. Mentioned him as one of my running back sleepers in a previous segment on the show, Jaleel McLaughlin. Almost had 1,000 yards last year, 910 yards in his rookie season, mind you, 5.4 yards per carry, albeit in a smaller sample size, like I said. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is you definitely want a tertiary option should a guy like Javonte Williams fail in certain regards. And Jaleel McLaughlin, what Javonte Williams brings in a more balanced sample size, Jaleel McLaughlin brings more speed and explosiveness, if that makes sense. I think that when we see them, you'll see that Javonte Williams is more of a patient runner, whereas Jaleel McLaughlin really uses his power and speed and strength to get out the open field. So they really complement each other rather nicely. And then the last guy in this running back room, who I really like, actually saw play live, Jersey guy out of St. Joe's Regional, Audric Estime. Now, the reason why I like Audric Estime, and when I did see him live, albeit it wasn't high school many years ago, he blends so perfectly physicality in the red zone with the length and power you need at the running back position. He's not necessarily a guy who we would think is going to be a speedster. He has very sneaky speed, but when he gets to the red zone, that's where he makes his bread and butter. 29 touchdowns in 2 seasons at Notre Dame. I'm really excited to see how he translates to the NFL, but he is right now the RB3 currently in the running back room. But the reason why you can't go wrong with any of these guys, at least in the flex or off the bench, is because of the variability and the different traits they bring. For example, if I were a fantasy football manager and I had Javonte Williams, I might use him in a week-by-week basis. I'm going to have to see the matchups because right now Javonte Williams is one of those streakier players. I want to love him more than I already do, but I just can't because of his streakiness. Then, if I actually do have a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin, I would use him more as a flex option. I wouldn't necessarily plant him into my starting lineup, but he does offer that upside because of his explosiveness, because of sometimes needing that boost in your offense, especially what with now Bo Nix coming into this setting. I really think Jaleel McLaughlin is ready for a breakout year. Already in that system, almost 1,000 yards last year. The question is he going to have more of a sophomore slump? As Tap to Learn says, PFF has Broncos O-line ranked 15, so not bad, but not great either. Yeah, there are some pieces there. A guy like Garrett Ballas, who has been there for a while, I believe Dalton Weisner is still there, if I'm getting that name correctly. They do have solid depth up front, but that being said, they aren't necessarily projected to be one of the top offenses. I think that it will take a while for Bo Nix to get settled, but that also allows the opportunity for these running backs to really get out there and show what they are capable of. And then let's talk about a player like Audric Estime. Before we get into that, Death Reaper. Ooh, we have a big one here. 10-man redraft PPR league where he has 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, 1 flex option. And this is his lineup. Got Hurts, CD, London, Devontae Smith, George Pickens, Kyron Williams, Jerome Ford, Dalton Kincaid. On the bench he has Najee Harris, Blake Corum, Jordan Mason, Hollywood Brown, and Christian Kirk. Doubts or thoughts? I really like the basis of the starting lineup. You got a guy in Jalen Hurts, solid fantasy quarterback. I think he's going to have a bounce back year. I think that he has a lot of nice weapons at his disposal. Saquon's going to take a little bit of the pressure off, maybe reduces his rushing numbers a little bit, but at the end of the day, he still has that ability. One of the better dual threat quarterbacks you can have at the QB position. Then your 3 wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Drake London, and Devontae Smith. You can't get much better than that. CeeDee, obviously, perhaps a guy who is going to be picked very highly. Maybe the first wide receiver taken overall in many drafts. And this was a redraft, so looking at CeeDee, you can't go wrong there. I think that he will have a big year, especially now that his contract situation is settled. And then you have a promising youngster in Drake London who finally has that QB play, perhaps with Kirk Cousins. So I really like that. And then Devontae Smith, you have that kind of stack there with Hurts and Smith. So I kind of like that. And I think that Devontae Smith will actually be not necessarily the wide receiver 1, but will lead the Eagles in receiving. I think that this is going to be his year. And then Pickens, Kyron Williams, Jerome Ford, and Dalton Kincaid, very interesting as well. George Pickens is kind of a streaky player. We'll have to see how, Russell Wilson will affect him. But he still profiles as the wide receiver 1 in that setup. Kyron Williams, I've been up and down on this guy. As much as I want to love him, he only still has that 1 year experience in the NFL. So this second year is really make or break for him, especially in a Rams offense that really adds so much variety. You have Puka there. You have Kupp there. The touches will definitely have to be kind of meted out. And then Jerome Ford, going to get a lot of carries early on in the season. I think that he's a nice, apt replacement for Nick Chubb. So I like that. And Dalton Kincaid, I love him. We're going to talk about him a little bit later in the show. In the Bills system, maybe going to see a lot more looks. Maybe even getting the lion's share of targets. On the bench, you definitely have a couple guys I'm a little skeptical about. Harris should project to be the RB1 in that Steelers setup, but I like Jalen Warren maybe a little bit better. And then Blake Corum obviously has insurance. Don't necessarily know too much about Jordan Mason at the current moment. Hollywood Brown maybe as the most value among your bench group because of what his speed could bring and means to the Kansas City Chiefs. And then Christian Kirk, I don't necessarily like Christian Kirk as much, but I hope the best for him because of the way he can get open with his speed is all going to translate to how he gets targets in that Jacksonville setup. So overall, I think the core of your team, that wide receiver trio of Lamb, London, and Devontae Smith, is perhaps the best aspect of this team. You also have a fantastic dual threat quarterback. We're going to have to see how Saquon affects that. So overall, I would give this team around a B+. I would say the bench holds it back a little bit, but the overall core of your team is very strong. But thank you so much for that comment, Death Reaper. I love examining people's fantasy teams and who they drafted, and any trade advice as well. Feel free to leave them in the comments. Before we go to break, I want to get back and touch upon a little bit more of the Broncos running back situation. Because at the end of the day, when you, perhaps much like what Death Reaper is trying to do, trying to find depth at the running back position, you can't go wrong with a lot of these guys. I think that Jaleel McLaughlin could profile as someone who moves up a couple of tiers as a running back, and Audric Estime is a very potent red zone threat. I think that he's going to get a lot of the red zone touches in this offense, so look out for him as well. But like I said, it's all going to depend on how Bo Nix feels. If Bo Nix wants a guy who can get him that extra yardage that he might need if he's not having his best day, then I think Jaleel McLaughlin will be the most effective. But I think that Javonte Williams still has the opportunity to break out in this running back room and to plant himself as the best running back of the bunch. But that's just about do it. Thank you so much for your comment, Death Reaper. I greatly appreciate it. Good luck to you in your fantasy exploits this year. But coming up next, we are looking at another interesting, contentious running back room. The Ravens of the West, they call them. Maybe that's a little bit hint of what the next segment's going to be. But we will be right back to discuss that running back room after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed the first two segments. I know I have, especially with Death Reaper's comment about his fantasy teams. Like I said, if you are still watching Death Reaper, good luck to you and your fantasy exploits. I think you have a very solid team. Maybe looking at the bench a little bit, you might want to bolster. But overall, you have a very solid team. Let's get back into our deep dives of certain skill position groups, especially in the AFC, because that's where all of the running back situations are very contentious. And this next team might be the most contentious one of all, because of their new head coach, because of their perhaps new philosophies on the offensive side of the ball, and because of these two guys they brought in, replacing a guy in Austin Eckler who has had and been one of the more solid pieces in that LA Chargers offense for the past couple of years. But the way they profile now, this could very well be one of the more surprising at year's end running back rooms in the league. So without further ado, let's talk about the LA Chargers running back situation. Now, why are they called the Ravens of the West? Well, because they just got two Ravens running backs. And what it means for the Chargers to get these two guys like this is what Jim Harbaugh is all about. His philosophy is running the football. Hey, it's what won Michigan the national title. Running the football, being more physical than the other guys. It may take a couple of years to take its true effect, but that seems to be the direction that this Chargers team is going in. But Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, let's talk about them a little bit, because they as well aren't necessarily quote-unquote superstars. But they worked so well in the Ravens offense because of the way their committee approach with these guys really supplemented what Baltimore wanted to do, while with the whole kind of spread option aspect of their offense with Lamar and them all over there. But now they're LA Chargers. It's going to be interesting to see how Jim Harbaugh uses them in his offensive setup. Let's talk about Gus Edwards first, because I think that he's projected to be the starter as well. Maybe has less injury concerns than J.K. Dobbins. We'll talk about those in a second. But last year, as Tap to Learn says, always liked Gus Edwards over Dobbins, but Edwards can't stay on the field. Well, we'll talk about both of them in terms of their injury histories, because Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, as much as I love them on the Ravens, and as much as their committee approach could work for the Chargers, it's all about in their injury history. But they still have decent numbers to kind of combat and mitigate for what they don't bring when they're out. Let's talk about Gus Edwards first. 810 yards on 198 carries last year, 13 TDs, 4.1 yards per carry. So as you can see, perhaps more of a red zone guy as well. Kind of like if Audric Estime were a couple years down the road, let's say. But Gus Edwards, what I love about him is he's not always going to have pretty numbers. He's going to have ugly numbers, but he gets those numbers by hard work and physicality. It's not necessarily going to be pretty in terms of fantasy if you are looking for a Chargers running back, let's say. But at the end of the day, if he stays healthy, like Tap to Learn did bring up and allude to, he will always be one of those guys with a high volume of scoring, perhaps a lot of touches in this Chargers offense. And with their new head coach and with their head coach's philosophies in turn, it could work magic on the football field. But let's also talk about J.K. Dobbins, because he brings a lot as well if he stays healthy, because I think that out of both of them, he has more of the injury history. J.K. Dobbins, to kind of bolster that comment I just made about his injury history, of the 67 games he was eligible for, missed 43 of them. He has had 13 career games of double-digit carries, so make of that what you will. Very few considering how many games he was eligible for, how many games he missed, and most importantly, what kind of value he brought to the Baltimore Ravens, both by being there, but by also being injured. He does average 6.2 yards per carry last year, 9 rushing touchdowns as well. So both of them, if anything, bring production. That's what they are going to bring in this Chargers running back room. But let's talk about how the Chargers might want to use them because of their lack of depth elsewhere. Because when I think of the Chargers and I think about who they have in certain positions, it certainly feels like there could be opportunities if they wanted to use Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins in more kind of varied ways. Gus Edwards could be a receiving back. Who knows? J.K. Dobbins could be more of the power back once he comes back from injury. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is the Chargers may not be the most exciting team on offense, but they certainly are starting to have a plan that can really work should Jim Harbaugh implement it correctly. I like what they did with the offensive line. Drafting Joe Alt to kind of bookend Rashawn Slater, one of the best tackles in the league. And they still have Justin Herbert, and they still have his arm talent, strength, and accuracy. Now, there has to be a kind of balance here, because you can't necessarily not use Justin Herbert and expect him to be happy about it, because there will be moments where Justin Herbert may have to throw the football. And you might not be as confident if you're Jim Harbaugh in the weapons you have, but I still think that you can't necessarily overlook what Justin Herbert brings to the table. So now that you have this kind of committee approach, you now have to start thinking about, well, how do these guys coming in really fit what A, my offense wants, and what B, what Justin Herbert wants. Because when I think about the Ravens, there's way more opportunities for the running game to feature prominently. I'm not saying that's not going to be the case for the Chargers this year, but I'm just saying that the Ravens were very wide open and variable in how they ran the football. The Chargers haven't necessarily been. They've really kind of relied upon Justin Herbert to work his magic. But I don't necessarily think that will work in a Jim Harbaugh system, mainly because of how these two running backs change things. Because if they stay healthy, they really provide not necessarily a depth, but they provide a certain aura of physicality that the Chargers might want to preach in the future. And so, getting Justin Herbert to that level as someone who's seen as more of a gunslinging quarterback, that's going to be kind of a challenge. And not for nothing, but out of all the running back rooms that I did mention, this one has a certain sameness to it. Because Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, more often than not, were asked to kind of do similar things in the Ravens' backfield. And while in a Jim Harbaugh setting that worked wonders in Michigan, will it work if the overarching sentiment of the offense has always been have Justin Herbert control it, and then, things will come together. But this year is going to look very different. And Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, as Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, Harbaugh's definitely a run-heavy system. Look at his number one pick. O-line, very big in his mind. I completely agree with that sentiment. I think that it's all going to come down to how Harbaugh implements these new guys in the O-line and how he implements Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. Because if Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins are solid, then that really does open up a lot more for Justin Herbert to exploit. And while he might not be throwing with the same volume as he had in the Brandon Staley era, he's still going to get opportunities down the field. And even though a lot of people don't necessarily like this Chargers wide receiver core, it still has a lot of upside to it. I still like Quentin Johnson as a vertical threat, Ladd McConkey as a high intelligence receiver, and also Joshua Palmer, very intelligent in his own right as well. So the Chargers offense definitely is going to be one to monitor very closely. But going back to Edwards and Dobbins, these are two guys, like I said. And like I said, with every single one of these running back groups, they're not going to start on your fantasy football team. But if you want a lot of production, perhaps more production than you might expect out of someone who's not necessarily in a high-end tier, then Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins can be that for you. But like Shep Easy Sweet Spot and Tap to Learn has said, as Sicker, another Rate My Team. Fantastic. Keep these kind of comments coming. Before we go to break, I will definitely look into this team sticker. Lamar, Jahmyr Gibbs, James Cook, a guy who I have, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Smith, Travis Kelce, DK Metcalf, Dallas defense. I believe that is Justin Tucker as your kicker. Got Zamir White, I believe, and T. Higgins on the bench. If Chase doesn't play, do I put T or DK as my flex? And this is also a fantastic team. Lamar, can't go wrong. Dual threat quarterback, that's what you're looking for. Gibbs as well. Gibbs is in kind of that second tier you might have looked at in the second round. I really like, but then James Cook is someone who I'm on the fence about this year. I liked him last year, but it's all going to come down to how Josh Allen feels in this new system. But I do think that he is going to be a make or break kind of player. He has a lot of boom or bust potential. Then obviously you have big guys in Tyreek Hill and Devontae Smith as your wide receivers, both really projected to have decent seasons. Travis Kelce as well, kind of that old guard sentiment in terms of the tight end, but he still has a lot of value. I think that there's going to be a lot more options for Patrick Mahomes in that Chiefs offense, but Travis Kelce will always be his number one for as long as he stays there. And DK, I love DK. always in that wide receiver 15 to 20 range, always gets you a lot of balance in your team, 10 to 15 points. And the Dallas D, perhaps top 3, top 5 defense in the league. Zamir White, I love this guy. A lot of people have been sleeping on him and T. Higgins. Now that he's franchise tagged, all that conundrum is over with on your bench. But the big question that you bring up, if Chase doesn't play, do I put T or DK as my flex? For the time being, I actually like DK a little bit more than T. Higgins. I think that when you look at the Seattle offense, I think that yes, they want to be more inclusive, and it's going to be a lot more variety now that Ryan Grubb is their offensive coordinator. But DK just brings something so unexpected to the wide receiver position. This real physicality at the catch point that really stands out amongst wide receivers. And he's not necessarily, the highest end tier 3 or so wide receiver, but he is someone who I appreciate, and this is not just my Seattle bias coming in. I really think that DK, you can't go wrong with. T. Higgins, I like, but I still think Jamar Chase will be the guy. And like I said, talking with the Bengals running back room, they also add a lot of variability to this offense early on. And point being, the Seattle schedule early on is kind of light in my opinion. They open up with Denver and New England, which should be 2 teams that they can really exploit. You can really get to see what the offense looks like. So for the time being, I'm more excited about DK as a flex option. But that being said, T. Higgins could still be valued. It's just that tenuous kind of contract debate really gives me pause about what T. Higgins' season could look like. But overall, I really like your team. I would give it kind of an A-, I think. I think you have a little bit of a deeper bench than what Death Reaper had. And I think that your depth at the wide receiver position is really going to help you. Maybe in the future, if you want to do some trades as well, have a lot of trade value. And you have guys on my bench who are going a little bit underrated in terms of how they're appreciated in the fantasy market. So overall, thank you for the comment. Like I said to Death Reaper, good luck on your fantasy exploits this year, sticker. But that being said, I do think that your team might be a little bit more of a value team. As he says, my second wide receiver is Davante Adams. I'm a Seahawks fan as well. Can't wait for the season with Grubb. I subbed and liked, by the way. Thank you so much. I'm always looking out for my fellow Seahawks fans. I hope we have a good season too. Let me know what you think in later episodes, sticker, as you become a fan of this show. Thank you again for your comment as well. Davante Adams, I think he's going to have a great year. Also someone who had a little bit of tension for the Las Vegas Raiders last year. If you watched receiver, I know why I did. There was a lot of tension there. But I still think at the end of the day, he's a value receiver. But thank you so much, sticker. Go Hawks. Go Hawks. But that will just take us to break. Coming up next, we transition from our deep dives into skill position groups around the league into our last of the sleepers and bust with our tight ends. Should be some good segments coming up. We'll be right back after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys are enjoying the show thus far. Thank you all for your comments. Shout out to Sticker, my fellow Seahawks fan. Thank you for subbing and liking to the show. Thank you as well for all those who've commented about their fantasy teams or left comments in general. I want to keep this going. I want to keep the show as interactive as possible. But let us transition kind of from our little deep dives around the league before the start of the season to our last of the sleepers and bust segments. We are still going to go into the tight end sleepers. We get another comment from Shep Easy's Sweet Spot as he gives his fantasy team. And Team Money has entered the chat, one of my favorite subscribers. I drafted in my big money league $200. Let's do this. 2 fantasy teams. Let's start off with Shep Easy's. We'll get yours, Team Money, in a little bit. We have Josh Allen, Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, Mark Andrews, Saquon Barkley, Drake London, Aaron Jones, Cleveland defense, Cameron Dicker the kicker, shout out Dicker the kicker from Texas, and Ladd McConkey. My thoughts on this lineup. I think that this lineup might be more valued in terms of your skill positions than most. I really like Mark Andrews still as a tight end. Let's hope that his injury history is not bad and doesn't continue on to the season, because he is someone I really like in that Ravens offense. Perhaps going to receive at least the second most targets in that Ravens offense than Devontae Adams, like I mentioned. That tension is there with the Las Vegas Raiders. Hopefully it goes away. Hopefully he's there for the long run. But if he is, he definitely adds that. But the inconsistent QB play could hold him back. Justin Jefferson as well. No, if you are my dad, he's a huge Vikings fan. Justin Jefferson, everyone loves Justin Jefferson. Perhaps profiling as the wide receiver 3 overall in fantasy football. That connection is, again, if Sam Darnold really is who the Vikings think he is, then maybe that connection is going to stick. And then I like the Cleveland D. I have them myself. They're the number 1 defense in the league. And in fantasy, can't go wrong with them. Ladd McConkey, I believe, off your bench. I think he's going to have a lot of upside. I think he's going a little bit under the radar. I think his intelligence will help him in this Chargers offense. We're going to have to see how many targets he gets because of that run-heavy philosophy and that run-heavy system in LA, like I talked about when I talked about the Chargers running back room. But overall, this team is deep. I like Aaron Jones as well. Maybe lay off the Vikings players a little bit. And Saquon as well, Drake London. So overall, I would give this team a solid A- as well. A lot of upside here, but a lot of talent in the receiver position that really needs to rely on the QBs a lot. That's my only worry. If the QBs don't play up to par, then who knows how these receivers will look. But just on paper, this profile is a very solid fantasy team. Let's go to one of my favorite subscribers, favorite commenters for the show, Team Money, 10-man PPR league. Patrick Mahomes, Josh Jacobs, James Conner, CeeDee Lamb, Drake London, Dalton Kincaid, DK, Worthy, and Ridley. Did I cook? I think you did. Patrick Mahomes, number 1 QB. That's as simple as that. Always going to be the number 1 QB in fantasy for however long he plays, forever long as the Chiefs keep supplementing him with players who like him. And then that little stack that you did there with Xavier Worthy, I believe, coming off your bench. I think he's going to be fantastic. Seeing him as a Texas fan coming out of Texas really adds a lot of value as a gadget guy. Can return punts, can go long, run routes. He's not just all about speed, so he's an exciting player off the bench. DK, I talked about him a little bit. Can't go wrong with him. Always in that wide receiver 15 to 20 range, like I said. I think that this is going to be another fantastic year for him. A lot of power, unexpected abilities at the wide receiver position. Dalton Kincaid, talked about him as well. I personally love him. I personally think that he will finish at the very least as a tight end 5 in fantasy. He sits right in that conversation with guys like Laporta, Kelsey, Kittle, Andrews, as one of those guys who wants to break into that top 5. And then Jacobs and Conner, very interesting running back. We talked about James Conner a lot last week in terms of what he brings to the table, especially what with Kyler Murray healthy as well. I would love to see what that backfield looks like. And then Josh Jacobs making the move to the Packers. I'm a little bit skeptical about him to see what he looks like moving to a new team. Didn't have the best of endings in Las Vegas as someone that Antonio Pierce reportedly wanted to build around actually on offense. But moving to Green Bay, let's see how he fits into that team. I think that they are going to be a pass-first system. They have a lot of young wide receiver talent. But I think that Josh Jacobs, you can't necessarily fault him for any of the deficiencies he's seen. A new setting for him could be exactly what he needed. So I did think you cook. I think that this might be perhaps the best team of the day. I like It's well-rounded at the wide receiver position. A lot of high upside at the running back position, perhaps the best QB in fantasy football right now. And a solid supplementary bench with some high upside wide receivers. So I think that you have nailed it. You did, in fact, cook Team Money. Thank you again for your comments. One of my favorite commenters. Keep the comments coming. But we got to get into this fourth segment of today's show a little bit, talking about some of the tight end sleepers that I'm really excited about. All of these guys, profiling these guys who are really exciting. Maybe you should keep an eye out for in the draft. So without further ado, let's jump right into them, starting off with a guy who really should see his numbers pop with the addition of Kirk Cousins as his QB, and that is Kyle Pitts. I really think the value with Kyle Pitts lays in his upside. I think that Kyle Pitts, yes, a lot of people were skeptical of him going forth overall a couple of years ago, but he still has a lot of upside in terms of the value he brings to a team in his youth and his physicality at the tight end position. I still think he has the necessary traits, maybe not to break into the top 5 for now, but maybe the top 10 this year. I think that the new OC in Zach Robinson, there might be an increase in 11 personnel, a lot more opportunities to align wherever and really create mismatches will arise for Kyle Pitts. He was a tight end 13 last year. That stands for something with you guys. He only did have 149 catches though, so a higher volume of targets could be in the cards this year for Kyle Pitts. He does have the touchdown production. He did have 6 touchdowns last year, so that's not a concern. So it's all about finding that connection with Kirk Cousins, because Kirk Cousins is someone who adds a lot of upside here. Now, the next guy really is going to vary on how his QB plays and if he can connect with him early on, because he is definitely someone who I really like, but it's going to come down to the rapport he develops with Deshaun Watson, and that is David Njoku. Oh, not David Njoku just yet, but we will go to him now that I mentioned him. Let's talk about his stats last year with Deshaun Watson and with Joe Flacco, because there is a heavy variation there. Weeks 14 through 17 with Joe Flacco as the Browns running back. He had 2 games of 26 or more fantasy points, 1 TD at the very least in 3 of those 4 games. Only 3 games overall of double-digit fantasy points did David Njoku have with Deshaun Watson as his QB. So make of that what you will. That being said, I certainly think that he's the best receiving option even for the Cleveland Browns. Like I said, as much as I still think that Amari Cooper could have some value, still be a consistent 1,000-yard receiver, he is getting up there in age. They were maybe talking about trading him away, but with the whole Brandon Ayuk situation, we're willing to bring in Ayuk and let go of him. So that goes to show that they may not trust him as much. And then you bring in a guy like Jerry Jeudy, who really did not stand out in, I believe, 2 or 3 years with the Denver Broncos. And Elijah Moore, I like him as a route runner, but I don't like him as someone who I can place my trust in as a wide receiver. And so that just leaves David Njoku as perhaps the best receiving option in this. So look for Kevin Stefanski to try and implement some of the things that made Baker Mayfield effective in this offense with this offense. That's what I've always wanted, for the Browns to either have kept Baker Mayfield in the first place or at least implement some of the things that Baker Mayfield loved to do in that system with Deshaun Watson, because that's basically what Deshaun Watson's best traits are: escaping the pocket, creating something with his legs, or even running to pass the football. That will open up a lot more avenues for this offense. So David Njoku could be boom, could be bust. We saw it last year in his stats when Deshaun Watson did start that he was more of a bust. But I think this year in the Cleveland Browns offense that really doesn't have much excitement and hype surrounding them outside of, guys like Jerome Ford, who could have a huge, bigger role in this offense, and a guy like Jerry Jeudy, who I really don't have the highest of expectations for. David Njoku could be the face of the Browns receiving game this year. And the last guy perhaps the biggest red zone threat out of all the tight ends on the market. Perhaps the guy who's going to get a lot of red zone targets. Maybe the most exciting guy in PPR terms for all those PPR players out there. Jake Ferguson. Let's go back to him. Jake Ferguson was 9th in receptions last year amongst all tight ends. 8th in receiving yards. Only 6 tight ends had more than 5 TDs. That just speaks to the volume of targets that Jake Ferguson gets, and speaks to where he gets them specifically. Because not only does Jake Ferguson present this physicality and versatility, he presents it in red zone areas, presents it in terms of his touchdown production. He presents it in terms of overall Cowboys offense outlook as well. Who outside of CeeDee Lamb is willing to step up in the system? Brandon Cooks, an aging Brandon Cooks? I don't think so. I think it's Jake Ferguson. I think that they're lucky to have him for now on a very team-friendly contract. He will get more expensive as years go on. They should look to tie him down, much like they did CeeDee Lamb in the future. I know he's not the main concern in this Cowboys offense in terms of contract situations, but he is someone who, outside of CeeDee Lamb, might be the Cowboys' best receiving option as well, especially in the red zone because of his physical presence. But you can't necessarily go wrong with many tight ends here, I would say, because in terms of the tight end market, and we will get into busts next, I think that we think of the tight ends as who I'm going to talk about in terms of busts as players who just have a lot riding on the season. It's not necessarily, oh, he's going to outright fall flat on his face this season. I think this is all about, playing the chess game that is fantasy football, because, like I said, you're going to start thinking about age being a concern amongst tight ends in the future when your Kelce's and Kittles start to get up there in age. Now, more than ever, the tight end market is a deeper pool to choose from, so you're going to jump to more conclusions about certain players than you might have before. You might jump the gun a little bit in terms of how you think. These tight end sleepers might not even project to be top 10 tight ends in about 3 to 4 years. This is just projection because of the depth of the tight end market. But that being said, these 3 guys probably are exciting in terms of how they'll profile into the offenses right now. I'm more concerned about, how the tight end market might not make them as high profile because of the fact that it's so deep. Because these guys, maybe in a different circumstance, would be, in my humble opinion, top 5 guys year in, year out. But that just shows the volatility of the position. That should just about do it. Thank you yet again for all your comments, especially from Team Money and Shep Easy Sweet Spots. Coming up next on the show to conclude today's show, we talk about, like I said, tight end busts, potential tight end busts. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment on today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We conclude our sleepers and bust segments with some tight end busts. Now, hypothetically speaking, there are some players on this list who I was skeptical about. That being said, this is just a quote-unquote projection. This is not me out and out saying, like I said before, these guys will ultimately fail. They'll fall flat on their faces and not perform this season. That just goes to show that in the tight end market, we're more hasty to jump to conclusions about these guys rather than, be patient and see how the tight end market evolves, because as of right now, it's ever evolving. It's evolving in ways that we might have never imagined. There's young players who are coming to the ranks, Laporta, Kincaid, guys of that nature, and then there's still guys like your Kelce's and Kittles. So this segment isn't necessarily supposed to put down any of these guys. It's just the circumstance of the position. That being said, let's jump right into it. And the first guy you might be the most mad about the included on this list, Travis Kelce. I know it sounds kind of crazy to put him on this list, but at some point you might start thinking about his decline. I know it sounds weird because as long as, him and Mahomes have had this connection, have been with each other, they have produced magic. But at the end of the day, if you're starting to see the ascendancy of these young players, if you're starting to appreciate Laporta and Kincaid more, as we saw in our comments, a lot of players, a common thread line was this younger tight end group who had team money with Dalton Kincaid. Sheppy's sweet spots did have Mark Andrews, though. Then I go to Sticker. He does have Travis Kelce. But then I go to Death Reaper, I believe, and he has Dalton Kincaid. So as you can see, there is kind of a debate about who to pick here. And more often than not, you might be compelled for a younger guy. That's just what I was thinking as well. Do I go out and get a younger guy? I do believe I have Kincaid. I'm going to have to go back and check to see my fantasy team, but I do believe I have Kincaid as one of my tight ends. So, this is not an indictment of Travis Kelce by any means. Throughout his career, 2,116.7 fantasy points since 2016. Nobody's taking that away from him. He's never finished worse than third. But this year projects as a year where tight ends finally get the respect, start gaining the respect as true fantasy position players. Much like what centers became in fantasy basketball and their value. I think that the way I view Travis Kelce now is trying to get ahead of when he does decline. So that when I know I'm going to be able to pounce on guys who before might not have had much value. So that's the only reason why Travis Kelce makes sense in this list, is because you have to foreshadow at some point his natural decline. But it's not an indictment of him. I wish the best for him. I think that he's going to continue to produce for as long as he is in a Kansas City Chiefs uniform. But eventually there won't be a time. So that's the only reason why I have him here. Coming up next, this guy's a little bit more obvious, just looking and judging by how his receiver room projects, how this Bears team is perceived, and that is Cole Kmet. I don't know why it isn't going. Okay, this Cole Kmet. I had him last year. Let's talk about him a little bit. There are times when Cole Kmet might give you a sense of hope and optimism about his potential because he has a lot of upside. He is on the younger side in terms of tight ends. But in a Bears system that's trying to create hype around its wide receiver core and Caleb Williams and the rapport that's developing there, where does that leave Cole Kmet? There are positives to him. He's never missed a game in his career. He did finish top 10 in terms of tight end fantasy projections 2 consecutive seasons. But this year doesn't seem like a year where being a Bears tight end is going to be a position of value. I want to like Cole Kmet. I entrusted him very often in my fantasy football team last year. I thought that he was one of my most valuable pieces because of his youth and because of the profile of the Bears offense, at least last year, where they didn't necessarily have much receiving depth. At the end of the day, the bottom line is, if you're in a team that can't necessarily supplement production outside of an exciting receiver core, then you might find yourself on a list like this. But it's not an indictment, like I said, not an indictment of any of these guys' abilities as a tight end. It's just the fact that the circumstance of the market right now leads us to jump to conclusions about certain guys. And Cole Kmet just happens to be one of them. But then to conclude our show with another tight end potential bust, Dallas Goedert. A lot of people may have forgotten about Dallas Goedert, kind of gets caught up in the morass of the tight end market, is still seen as one of those tier 3 kind of guys you get in later rounds. But I don't necessarily think that he's someone who has much upside as a Kelsey or Kmet, or still has that level of production. Because listen to this. He hasn't ever hit 60 receptions in a season. Held to 3 touchdowns 3 of the past 4 seasons. And his yards per target dipped from 10.2 to 7.1 from 2022 to last year. So Dallas Goedert actually has seen a statistical decline that you can read into more than guys like Kelsey or Kmet. Because Kelsey or Kmet are shots in the dark because they're bust or they're boom. Think about that for a second. Dallas Goedert is someone who you can see the decline in. When I look at the Philadelphia Eagles offense, especially this year, they're an offense who I really think is not necessarily placing as much value in terms of production in the red zone. They're more trying to open up avenues in open space for certain weapons. I think that's why they brought Saquon Barkley in, is to open up more situational football opportunities, because they did often rely too much on the vertical pass to get them. That way, this opens up a lot more avenues for this Philadelphia Eagles offense, and someone has to suffer, and I think that sufferer will be Dalton Kincaid. Let me know what you think in the comments. But kind of to sum up the entirety of what I've said about tight ends to this point, before we kind of let them be for a while on this show. I think that when you talk about the position, and when I look at how the sleepers and busts compare, the sleepers are guys who are on the younger side, but they're in offenses where their abilities might be an aberration at the tight end position. When I think about Jake Ferguson and I think about David Njoku, they have more opportunities. They have more opportunities for volume and for production as a result. It's all just stemming down to how the quarterbacks react to that. If the quarterback can develop a rapport with them. Kyle Pitts as well. Kyle Pitts can project to be a 1,000-yard tight end. It's just the quarterbacks. All of these guys in the sleepers, I don't necessarily think are top 10 yet, even though some of their stats might suggest it. The guys in the busts have had seasons where they have been in the top 10. Kelsey, more often than not. Cole Kmet in 2 consecutive seasons. So it's really just following more meticulously the stats, because the stats are going to tell more of the truth than what you see on the field, I believe, because Dallas Goedert, at the very least, has stats that have consistently declined. but I feel like you can't necessarily jump to conclusions. That's the overarching sentiment I'm trying to leave you guys with before we end the show. You can't necessarily jump to conclusions about certain positions, especially the tight end position, because if you do, then you might lose out on a guy who ends up becoming a superstar. And that's how it's so hard to gauge. But make of these what you will. In the future, we're ending the show right now, so comments, I will at least take one, but let me know what you think in future shows in the comments. That will just about do it for this show. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you yet again to all those who commented today. Really appreciate the interaction. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show as a whole. It really helps the network, me and my fellow podcasters as well, and continue, like I said, with making yourselves available to the super chat, super things, and super sticker features on YouTube. They're really a huge part of the show and what makes it so fantastic. But that has been this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with another fantastic show.